Dobry день, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Zaporizhzhia, Fact or Fiction.
I think we lost Nadia's connection. Okay.
Am I breaking up?
Yeah, let me just go forward. Let's thank our expert, Dr. Yuri Kostenko and General Hodges. Let's review some facts that are bases and claims that are the basis of this discussion today. The Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant was occupied in March 2022 by invading Russian forces. There were some damages as a result to the plant. A four-person international atomic energy delegation has twice visited in 8 months, stating that the plant appears to be safe. However, they have not given full access to the plant, and Russia has not followed any of the or implemented any of the safeguards that were suggested. Recently, the White House announced that it's following the situation at the plant closely and does not believe that there is an imminent catastrophe, though neither imminent or catastrophe are explained. During the past few weeks, as what provoked this panel is that Moscow and Kyiv have been accusing each other of sabotage, potential sabotage, false flag operations that will leak radiation. And in March, the Brookings Institute stated that they believe that it is possible that this is the first time in any of the history of warfare that actually a nuclear power plant was used as a nuclear shield. And The Guardian, in an editorial, said that they believe Putin, since he's losing the war, has absolutely no reason to withhold creating some kind of false flag operation. So we're going to ask to comment on the veracity of a lot of these facts, as well as additional questions. However, we'll begin with Dr. Kostenko. Dr. Yuri, recently, 5 days ago, the American Nuclear Society published a statement that, as far as they're concerned, the construction of the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant was so well constructed that it can neither explode nor can even things like missiles break it apart. Ergo, there's very little chance of any kind of accident, intentional or otherwise, that will leak radiation into the air. And even if water leaks out of the containment units, irradiated water, it will only leak in a small, limited area. Can you please comment on that?
Thank you for inviting me to take part in this discussion. I want to say that the statements of the American Nuclear Society disagree with the realities of use of nuclear energy and those accidents which already took place before. I would like in part to remind those esteemed experts of the American Nuclear Society that the general designer of Chernobyl-type nuclear reactors, Professor Alexandrov from Moscow, was claiming back in those days that this was world's safest reactor. They were so safe, he said, that you can build them even in the Red Square in Moscow next to the Kremlin. Well, nobody built that station near the Kremlin, but they did build it near Ukraine's huge city and capital, city of Kyiv. And as we all know, in 1986, one of those nuclear reactors exploded. The power of the nuclear explosion was such that experts equate it to 300 Hiroshimas. In other words, 300 tactical nuclear charges all exploded in one reactor of the Chernobyl power plant. Taking into account that the designers had not foreseen such a big-scale accident, likewise there were no plans for response and consequences liquidation when any such nuclear accident takes place for any of the stations, including Chernobyl. And this is the reason why the response action in the most important period after the accident were chaotic, and those actions caused a lot of mistakes. Therefore, as a result of that accident, there was a huge nuclear active contamination of not just Ukrainian territory, but also of neighboring countries, Belarus, Russia, and then later on the radioactive cloud moved towards Europe, and it even reached the United States of America. Likewise, there was no knowledge of the methods of response and liquidation of consequences. Tens of thousands of military servicemen of the former USSR were deployed to liquidate the consequences. This was a huge army of people, and all of them later died because they had been exposed to huge doses of radiation. Speaking of other consequences of Chernobyl, that includes the 30-kilometer radius of the exclusion zone and the dislocation of many residents who were exposed. This is a lot of costs that had to be spent, close to $70 billion in today's prices, and that's also huge losses of Ukraine all through the years until today. Once again, I would like to emphasize that theoretically such an accident was deemed impossible. Let's talk now about Fukushima in 2011. Mr. Yuri, while you are moving on, a question came from a journalist of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And just to clarify, you are saying that even the American Nuclear Society and the IAEA stated there can be no nuclear accident either intentionally or accidentally. Cannot happen because that station is built, that power plant is built so safely. And you disagree, and you're saying the same apply to Chernobyl. So, indeed, if there can be an accident, then the question is...
What kind of warnings should the U.S. and the EU give to Russia to prevent Moscow from blowing up any part of the power plant? And what kind of access does the IAEA need to really inspect the plant?
First of all, I would like to express my disagreement with the claims of the American Nuclear Society about about safety, even if an explosion takes place. Again, I bring Fukushima as an example. The Fukushima reactors were built with a very strong protection from seismic danger, from earthquakes, and nevertheless it was those reactors, when the actual earthquake took place with a tsunami, they all three exploded. Number 4 had its active zone melted. That took place in contradiction to all the existing manuals on construction and maintenance of nuclear power plants. In other words, at that time, neither the IAEA nor the American Nuclear Society had been speaking about the possibility of such an accident. And so, to make claims like some representatives of IAEA are claiming, especially Director General Grossi, and also the American Nuclear Society representatives are saying that Zaporizhzhia power plant is safe. I totally disagree, again, based on the previous records, previous experience of other accidents which had not been foreseen by any experts, either IAEA or anyone else in the world, unfortunately. Now, going back to the theme of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant, I would like to tell the reputable experts from IAEA or the American Society, do you have any experience of responding to nuclear accidents in a country that is at war, a country in a combat zone? There is no such experience in the world. That is unprecedented. And so to claim that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant is in safety, I can absolutely state with responsibility. They are repeating Kremlin's talking points. Unfortunately, General Director of IAEA did not accuse Russia of nuclear terrorism previously. He made a very, to put it mildly, unprofessional statement in Davos last year that Ukraine's nuclear power plant has 30 tons or 40 tons of highly enriched uranium and even more of plutonium. That is the amount of nuclear explosives to manufacture thousands of tactical nuclear warheads. That is totally absurd, and I would like to say with full responsibility that all those so-called peacemaking statements intended allegedly not to excite world public opinion about the possibility of such nuclear catastrophe that will expand outside Ukraine to the territories of the NATO countries and southern regions. That is a terrible theme which Western experts should address with greater responsibility. And speaking of your answer, how we can stop Putin. Putin as a dictator understands only one thing, and that is enforcement of an aggressor to peace. This is a terrorist state which only understands not the power of words, but the power of action. And there was previously a situation when Putin began to make threats to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, when this so-called special operation totally failed. But at that time, the world found certain arguments. The military experts and political leaders found a way to force Putin to give up that crazy idea, that mad idea. So I'm sure that now is the time to make exactly the same kind of warnings for Putin about consequences, including personal consequences for himself if he dares to set up a nuclear accident and that peaceful facility.
Mr. Kostenko, I'm going to go to General Hodges at this point, and to follow up, just sticking with the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and because at the end we're also going to get a little bit towards the Vilnius and the relationship between the two situations. Can you explain how would it be possible if, let's say, Ukraine took over Crimea, took over Donbass, got all the territory back? How do you dislodge a military force that is occupying a nuclear power plant without creating a disaster?
Well, Irene, if I may, I would like to address Trudy's question also just briefly. She asked, what should we be doing to prevent this? And I would say that making sure that every Russian that is anywhere in the chain of responsibility for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, from the local commander all the way up to the very top, that they all know that they will be held accountable. They should feel a tightness in their chest that their identity is known to the international community, and if something happens there, that Russians will be held accountable. In fact, I would advocate putting their name and their picture, publishing that, so that we all know who actually bears responsibility. And I think if people know that one day they could be sitting in The Hague in front of a tribunal, they will be a little bit less cavalier about being dangerous around this nuclear power plant, any aspect of it. So that's something that I would advocate as part of this. And then, of course, our president of the United States should reiterate that if something happens, if there's a catastrophe, that there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia. If they do that, they will pay a big price. And I would say, finally, we should be publishing what in the military we call it a downwind message that shows if there is an accident of some sort at Zaporizhzhia, different types, different weather conditions, what areas would be affected over the next several weeks following that, so that nations around there realize this will affect them, and they should all be putting pressure on the Kremlin to make sure that nothing happens there. This is part of our deterrence efforts. Now,
Well, may I interrupt you here, because actually then we'll go back to the question I asked you originally, how do you militarily dislodge an occupant? But I would like to return to Dr. Kostenko, because what you just said about the notification of the area is one of the questions that we received from Katerina Yushchenko, and I will switch to Ukrainian for just a minute.
Mr. Yuri, the question from Katerina Yushchenko. What, in your opinion, could be the worst-case scenario of damage to damage from the accident? What territories will be destroyed most of all, and how far it can go? This coincides with the remarks from General Hodges that right now, Ukraine and other entities need to publish maps that will show how radiation may expand and impact other countries. What is your idea of a notion of the worst-case scenario? The worst-case scenario would be the destruction of the cooling system for the reactors by Russians. That would be a replication of the Fukushima accident, when owing to interruption of the cooling, the nuclear contaminated waters mixes with air, and this mix spreads around and explodes, breaking the protective walls like chicken eggs. And that terrible scenario can be replicated at Zaporizhzhia Power Plant. And speaking of the scale of the possible contamination, again comparing with Chernobyl accident, where the explosion took place at one reactor of 1 million megawatts power. Here we have 6 of those, and if all 6 explode, then we cannot even foresee theoretically the scale of the nuclear damage. The most massive damage will be done to those territories which are within the so-called rows of the winds, the predominant wind directions. And by the way, the predominant winds there are blowing towards Russia, towards Turkey, into the southeast, then also somewhat to the west, and less so to the north. That's where most of Ukraine's territory is. And so based on such meteorological conditions, we can foresee big-scale contamination of territories outside Ukraine rather than Ukraine itself. Number 2, the most difficult challenge would be a big leak of nuclear active fluids into the Dnieper River and everything south of Energodar down the stream. That will become a huge nuclear active, radioactive Jurassic Park. We cannot calculate the scales of that, but the Black Sea and even the Mediterranean Sea will have excessive radionuclides. You see, Japan was dumping such waters into the Pacific Ocean, but we do not have a Pacific Ocean here, so the scale of damage to all the residents will be much bigger. And the most important thing is not that. Again, I want to emphasize that there is no precedent of how to respond and minimize consequences of an accident in a zone of warfare. No such experience before. Nobody knows how to do this. In Chernobyl, tremendous amount of mistakes had been made by those who were in charge at the time. But here, we cannot even envisage or talk about what kind of scales of various damage can happen. You know, you must have really very big fantasy, and I, with all my knowledge about nuclear safety, I cannot even foresee the worst case scenarios, but they truly will be terrible.
Thank you. Дякую. Very quickly to summarize, so the main point of the maps or the area of distribution will tend to be actually not onto Ukraine, but into the direction of Turkey, southern Russia, Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the coastal countries around the Black Sea. So really, this is a huge danger not only for Ukraine, but the nearby southern countries because of the direction of the winds in general. However, all that is discussing just in theory, because the reality of is we have never, humanity, experienced the occupation, military occupation of a nuclear power plant. And despite constant reassurances that nothing bad can happen, the only way nothing bad can happen is for the occupation to end, for the armies to leave, and for it to not be a military object. So we return to you, General Hodges. How do you stop, or I mean, this may be just a rhetorical question at this point, how do you get an army out of a nuclear power plant, an occupying force?
There's 3 or 4 aspects to this, and I have to say, I am so impressed with the incredible bravery of the IAEA inspectors who have been in there, not only because of concern about the haphazard way the Russians deal with these things, but also just the threat of something happening while they're there because of the Russians. So a real impressed, and thanks to those professionals. I think a big part of getting the Russians out of there requires international pressure. And this is why I advocate for not only showing the names and faces of people who are responsible, but also broadcasting, publishing who would be affected. So the nations that would be affected, they should be exercising every possible means of pressure on Russia, economic, diplomatic, and every other means, legal means, to make sure that the Kremlin knows that there will be consequences for them. And you know, Turkey obviously can play a significant role here if people in Turkey see that they would be affected when they see the graphic of where this would all go. And I live here in Germany. People here of a certain generation are still traumatized by Chernobyl. I mean, young women who were small girls during that time who were exposed to the radiation that passed over Germany have thyroid problems. So I mean, they can connect it to there. This is decades after the incident. So I think I agree with the professor that this is not something that we can take lightly, whatever the design strengths are. I think that we should seriously be thinking about antidote, having on hand the medicines that can be taken to help protect people from radiation exposure. I mean, we need to start thinking about how many millions of people would be affected if this were to happen. And it'll be too late to start looking for it after the incident happened. So I think it would not be too hasty or imprudent to start looking for the antidote type medicines that could be used to help protect people from radioactive exposure. Now, to the more specific task of securing the nuclear power plant, I suspect that this is one of the objectives of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. I don't know that, and the Ukrainian General Staff does a very good job protecting information. But just judging from the map, and appreciating their concern about the potential for a Russian-initiated catastrophe there, they will have been thinking for months how to secure the nuclear power plant. Obviously, you're not going to attack it the way you would attack a normal objective with indirect artillery and those kind of things. But I would expect that there would be attempts to isolate the nuclear power plant, to cut it off from any other Russian forces, to isolate it, and then to give the Russians a chance to leave it, to say, look, you don't have to die here. You can leave, you can take all your stuff with you, get out of here, or you can surrender. You don't have to go back to Russia if you don't want to, but isolate it in a way that where Ukraine has control over the exterior, if you will, both close in and more broadly, because certainly Russians will attempt to counterattack or use artillery against Ukrainian forces around in that region. So that'll be part of the overall plan, I would expect. And then it's a matter of how much risk are the Ukrainians willing to take. You don't want to risk having artillery or mortars or rockets or anything being used in and around that plant. But I would imagine that Ukraine has forces that are capable of doing this in a way that is done with the least possible collateral damage, the least possible risk to any of the facilities. They'll know exactly where everything is, just how Professor Kostenko described it. So they'll know, they will have practiced. And I feel pretty confident that once they have isolated this place, if the Russians do not leave of their own accord, then Ukraine will have capabilities to help re-secure that nuclear power plant.
This kind of leads into a little bit of the nuclear blackmail question, because the assumption is that if Ukraine takes it back, the risk of nuclear blackmail decreases. How much do you think the fact that the Russians are occupying currently the plant, that it is being used as a nuclear shield, influences decision-making either in the West at this upcoming NATO summit or specifically with the Biden administration? Is it really an element of nuclear blackmail, or is it, as some Western experts saying, it's kind of a non-issue? Where do you fall on that?
Well, there's two or three aspects to this. First of all, this is a reminder of how reckless and irresponsible and dangerous Russia is as a government. This government is, that they have absolutely no respect for international law. They have no respect for international agreements. They don't respect international agencies. And so we should be very sober and clear-eyed about expecting Ukraine to negotiate with the Kremlin, because the Russians have a wonderful record over centuries of never living up to any agreement unless they're forced to. And so this is an important reminder of how willing they are to destroy not only thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of lives, but also environmental damage, as we've already seen with their destruction of the Kakhovka Dam. And I'm a little concerned that because we did not really respond very strongly after the destruction of that dam, that the Russians might think that we might not respond too much if they cause a problem here at the nuclear power plant. So part of this is deterrence, and they need to be very, very clear that there will be consequences for them. Though at the summit, this is also a reminder to us that when you do give in or hesitate because Russia threatens to use, whether it's a nuclear weapon or they give the impression that they would be willing to create a nuclear catastrophe with a nuclear power plant, they see how we hesitate. In fact, we are deterring ourselves. And this sends a message, this every time we do this, that's oxygen for the Kremlin. They see that all they have to do is threaten to do this, but it also sends a terrible message to North Korea, Iran, and other places that have nuclear weapons and who wish us harm, that we are vulnerable to even the threat of a tactical nuclear weapon. or loss of control of a nuclear power plant.
Thank you. Dr. Kostenko, a question to you. What kind of monitoring does Ukraine have right now over the power plant? How is it getting its information? Except for the 2 visits that we know of, the IAEA, are there other visits to monitor the plant? That's one part of the question. And the second part really actually is not with the plant specifically, but with as General Hodges mentioned, the Kakhovka Dam explosion. Are there any plans underway for the cleanup of the Dnipro River right now?
Speaking of monitoring of the situation at Zaporizhzhia power plant, there are some Ukrainian military presence there. I mean, reconnaissance teams and special operations teams who work in that area, and they can collect some information from local residents, which the residents of Energodar or the personnel of the power plant who did not sign contracts with the Russian nuclear administration. They remain Ukrainian patriots, and they are trying in any possible way to deliver important information to us, not only about the mines planted there, but also about the general situation. Just a few days ago, Energy Atom Administration of Ukraine announced that Russians sent very incompetent managers to the power plant. Those who had worked there before, those who had been sent from Russia, they were called back and replaced them with some who have minimal professional training and competence. And that's in the conditions when this power plant becomes a high threat, high security threat. Speaking of the IAEA experts, they have very limited capability to monitor the situation. They are monitoring systems of permanent monitoring, which is supposed to be carried out by IAEA. That's monitoring of the storage of used nuclear power plant. Those have been turned off. Same applies to their access to the spaces there. The Russians are not allowing them to go there, especially the place where explosives have been planted. We know all that from the reports by the Ukrainian personnel of the station. Speaking of what kind of measures that could be taken by Ukraine in order to prevent this potentially terrible nuclear accident. Of course, the Ukrainian armed forces and special operations forces of Ukraine have some action plans for that situation, but I want to point out that they did try to make a landing of boats in the past, and it was a failure because the situation for the Ukrainian forces in that area is very difficult. Things became a little easier most recently because the Kakhovka water reservoir became more shallow, and now there are new potential passages for more effective penetration into Energodar. This is not mentioned, but that is a possibility. So Ukrainian forces might make a preventive strike at the occupants at the currently holding the power plant and force them to leave quickly. But there's another problem here. Again, this is not official information, but based on the messages which I received from the personnel there, the explosives could have been planted with capability for remote activation. Speaking of Kakhovka reservoir, by the way, there had been a story claiming that Russians only intended to make a small damage to the dam that would just prevent Ukraine's capability to cross the reservoir and reach the eastern bank. But as always happens, something went wrong in the Russian implementation, and we saw a big catastrophe. By the same token, something can go wrong in the Russian action of this war around the power plant, and we can see a scenario that will bring totally different outcomes that no experts of IAEA or anybody else could have foreseen. Thank you, Dr. Yuri.
General Hodges, two questions. Let's face it. The big thing on Zaporizhzhia and the power plant was a huge issue up until next Friday, and now we're all looking at Vilnius, which begins tomorrow. And so, some questions to you on that area. One of the questions that we received last night is, why is it that Ukraine needs admission to NATO? Why not just give Ukraine all the weapons that it needs and worry about admission later?
Well, it's an interesting perspective, but these are not exclusive of each other. I mean, you don't have to do one or the other. What I anticipate the alliance is going to do is have very clear, strong language this week in Vilnius that talks about the inevitable membership of Ukraine in NATO and a path ahead of how this is going to happen. But that should not, working on that doesn't do anything to delay or affect whether or not the West continues to provide capabilities to Ukraine. I anticipate the United States will keep doing what it's doing. I wish we would do more in terms of providing the long-range precision weapons like ATACMS, for example, and also the F-16s aircraft to help. But the two, it's not one or the other, I guess, is the point that I'm trying to make. And look, this is not just about Ukraine. Europe's security is better the minute that Ukraine joins the alliance. And so I think I can sense and feel a growing number of countries as well as experts that are and influencers that are seeing that the way ahead is to bring Ukraine into the alliance. We're not going to see a formal invitation this week.
Do you think that lack of formal invitation will have the effect that President Zelensky mentioned during a CNN interview, that it will impact the morale of the Ukrainian troops in a negative way?
Well, of course, President Zelensky knows his soldiers and his people better than anybody. And I think it will be frustrating, as it should be, just like it's frustrating for other nations that have sought membership in NATO. But at the same time, I think that the nations of the alliance, the 50 nations that make up the Ramstein contact group, will be looking for ways to continue supporting with ammunition, equipment, weapons, as well as diplomatic support, intelligence support, and so on. And these soldiers, they know that they are defending their homeland. They're literally defending their families. And so I have great confidence that they are going to keep doing their job as they have been doing.
One of the things we discussed briefly before the webinar began, and I'd like, if it's possible for you to expand on it, is that for whatever reason, and that could be part of the answer, for what reason, the West seems to have not absorbed or somehow missed or consistently ignores Ukraine's long history and of resistance. It is not something that just popped up 6 years ago when Donbass and Crimea were invaded. This has been going on, well, at least for the last 100 years, for 20th century, throughout the 20th century, but even earlier than that. What is it about the inability to sort of shift gears and understand that truly, come hell or high water, the Ukrainians this time are not going to stop. This is it. This is the last straw. And why is the West moving so slowly and doesn't understand that? What are they expecting?
I appreciate that, but I'm not going to accept that characterization. For sure, most people in the West, if they don't pay close attention to Central and Eastern Europe, they won't be familiar with the history of Ukraine the way that you are, obviously, or that I have become over the last few years. But for almost all the living Americans who are aware of anything that happened in Europe, since the end of the Second World War, of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And so there weren't many people that knew about it. And so, you had to be a student. You had to intentionally try to study it. But for the average person in the US or even Western Europe, it would not be in the front of mind. So I think to say everybody's moving too slow, that I don't know that that's a reasonable criticism. But the fact is we are moving slow. I would also ask all my Ukrainian friends, what did you do after 2014? I mean, we had American soldiers in Ukraine. We had Canadian soldiers in Ukraine that were helping to train, helping to convert the Ukrainian army from an old Warsaw Pact army with Soviet-type thinking and Soviet-type leaders into a Western integrated army that would take advantage of the talent of the incredible young people of Ukraine's armed forces. But why was Ukraine not making ammunition? Why was Ukraine not producing equipment that you're now demanding that the West provide? And I'm glad we are providing it. But this war in Ukraine is about failed deterrence. The West failed because we did not respond after Russia's invasion of Georgia or Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. But also, Ukraine did not. I was in Kyiv before February last year. It did not look like a place that was ready for a war. In fact, Ukroboronprom was making tanks, top quality tanks in the famous plant in Kharkiv in 2017 for export. So I think, yes, the West is moving too slow. Yes, my president needs to say we want Ukraine to win, and we're going to provide everything that's needed. And yes, we need to open our eyes to who Russia is. But I think it's not helpful. It's not productive to say, well, you people in the West are moving too slow, because I don't think that's accurate.
Okay, we'll accept that. We'll accept that answer. All right. So what do you envision as a happy ending? How is I can't say it any other way. What is the happy ending here?
Well, no, that's good. The happy ending is Ukraine ejects Russia out of Ukraine, that it regains control of all of its sovereign territory, the 1991 borders, the thousands of young Ukrainian children who have been abducted, deported, or brought back. Russian war criminals are held accountable for their crimes. Hundreds of billions of Russian assets are seized and used to help pay for reconstruction of Ukraine. Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, and the United States wakes up and realizes we need to have a strategy for the greater Black Sea region. There's a reason that Catherine the Great annexed Crimea at the end of the 18th century, because of where Ukraine sits on the map. And so we've got to think strategically about the Black Sea region and stop talking about Ukraine as if it's an island.
Thank you for that. That's absolutely true. And we go back to the early years of independence. Dr. Kostenko, we were there. That was actually one of the programs in Ukraine's parliament that we were trying to, or Ukraine was trying at the time to push through, is that that Ukraine really is, instead of being focused north towards Russia all the time or east towards Russia, needs to be focusing south towards Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Moldova, Greece, and the Mediterranean countries. And that is and even the Middle East, that is what is economically and strategically important to Ukraine. That idea kind of rolled to an end and never went anywhere. But I do want to underline that idea has been brought up even 30 some odd years ago and should be brought up again, because that is absolutely true and correct.
But fortunately, Senator Shaheen and Senator Romney, they get that. And they have sponsored legislation that would require the U.S. government to develop a strategy for the Black Sea region that would encompass not just military or security cooperation, but also economic development, diplomatic efforts, and the regional approach would also cause us to look at Georgia in a different way as a portal between Europe and Eurasia. It would cause us to think differently and work harder to protect our relationship with Turkey, which is always under great pressure. So a strategic view is a way to do this.
What are your thoughts about the recent information that came out in less than a week ago that there have been off the record, as they were claimed, bilateral talks with Russia? Is this a positive thing in the sense of we're getting intelligence and getting information from Russia, what's going on? Or is this something that actually undermines the U.S. position or the West position because it sends a message to Ukraine that, well, we promised you that, nothing with you, without you at the table, but we have to also take care of our own interests. What are your thoughts on that situation?
You're talking about this unofficial delegation that was there. Yeah, I think it's very, very unhelpful for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's the same guys who have been mishandling Russia in previous administrations, so that they are somehow still of a mindset. And these are intelligent people, by the way, hardworking, intelligent people, but they still have this romanticized notion that somehow we can deal with Russia as a responsible state, and that somehow Russia could be brought back into the fold of responsible nations. And so we lost 8 years dealing with Russia during the Obama administration. Of course, during the Trump administration, it was a total catastrophe. And now the same people that mishandled Russia during the Obama administration, then they're still working in the Biden administration. So at some point, these people have got to be either recognized and understand who Russia truly is, that it only respects strength. It has no respect for anybody that comes hat in hand wanting to negotiate and willing to trade away land or whatever. They will smash any agreement that they ever sign unless they're forced to live up to it. So I think it's unhelpful. And exactly to the point that you said, the promise by the United States, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And even if these three guys went there without being sent by the administration, it feeds the perception that, we are doing something behind their back. And for sure, people at this level could not just hop on a Lufthansa flight and get into Moscow without having some sort of tacit approval or awareness by the administration.
Just one more question to you, General Hodges. At one point, you said that you believed that if Ukraine got everything it needed, and it needed should be defined, that it could end this war by the end of summer. Do you still stick with that?
What I have always said is that if we provided Ukraine what they needed, specifically long-range precision weapons and aircraft, that they could liberate Crimea by the end of this summer. That was exactly what I said. If we provided those capabilities, that Crimea could be liberated by the end of this summer, because those capabilities would give the Ukrainians the ability to make Crimea untenable for Russian forces. If Ukraine had ATACMS with 300-kilometer range, now the Black Sea Fleet would have already had to depart Sevastopol. They couldn't sit there and have ships hit or port facilities destroyed by ATACMS. So, and that's how you liberate Crimea. You make it you isolate it, and then you make it untenable with long-range precision weapons, and then leave the Kerch Bridge up so Russians have a way to get the hell out of there. So yes, I believe that. But unfortunately, because the administration has not committed to Ukraine winning, and even balks at the idea of being clear about Crimea being liberated, they have not made the decision yet to provide those ATACMS or the F-16. So my caveat, yes, I still believe it, but I don't think they're going to do it. So it's going to take longer than to the end of the summer.
Do you want to speculate as to, or offer maybe even not a speculation, but a reason as to why they're not going to do that or why they're not doing it?
I mean, the administration, again, the same Russia people, experts from the Obama administration are there now, and they are overly concerned about the possibility of Russian escalation. And so it's clear that number one priority for the administration is to avoid any nuclear escalation. So they stopped short of doing what needs to be done because of that. And I also think that the Chinese have something to do with this. I think the Chinese are communicating they do not want to see a collapse of the Russian Federation government, because the Chinese want to maintain access to cheap gas. And they also, President Xi, I'm sure, does not want to see a collapse of an autocratic regime, which would then expose his own vulnerabilities as well. I apologize that I have to drop off, but
thank you very much. We understand.
Professor Kostenko, thank you very much for the privilege of doing this with y'all.
Thank you very much. Dr. Kostenko, General Hodges mentioned that regardless of all the assurances that nothing's going to go wrong, that the Ukraine and all the other regions already should be prepared and being supplied with medications such as iodine pills and other preemptive capabilities to protect themselves against a possible accident. Is there such an effort underway? Are you aware of it? Who's pushing for it? And what can you comment about that situation?
From the legal standpoint, the whole responsibility for what happens at Zaporizhzhia Power Plant is with the Russian occupying force. They occupied it, they keep it under control. The Ukrainian authorities are not capable to be responsible for anything that happens there. This is number one to keep in mind. Full responsibility is on the Russian occupying force. Number two, regarding assistance. Again, if it were peaceful times, then we could make some calculations as to how assistance could be delivered into the damaged zone, the contaminated zone. But can anybody in the world give me an answer and explain how such as assistance could be delivered to the people who suffer from the nuclear power plant accident if there is a combat action in place? Which country will agree to send its first responders, volunteers, medics, anyone to deliver this assistance, this aid? You understand how absurd is this question? The world needs to be prepared to deliver assistance to Ukraine. What assistance and to whom? The dictator of Russia, Putin, with his mad ideas of destroying the world, he's the one who controls the power plant in Zaporizhzhia, or to those military units of Russia which are holding the power plant. Do you know that the Russian general who was in charge of those troops when they were seizing this power plant, I think his name is Vorobyov, he actually said to his soldiers, this land will either be Russia or it will be scorched by radiation. You need to remember those specific things that were happening and continue to be happening in this terrible war. By the same token, a Russian general was ordering Russian soldiers to go into this radioactive burial place of contaminated stuff in Chernobyl to dig trenches. They probably all dead by now. So how can we persuade the Russian generals and the Russian soldiers about the danger they are exposing us to? How can you persuade those hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers who already got killed in this war? How can we persuade them to leave this terrible and this absolutely stupid, absurd war that Putin launched against the democratic world? It's not possible, and there's only one way to impact Putin and the Russian invaders. It's just force. Our General Zaluzhny was right saying that Russians need to be killed and killed until they choose to leave our territory. And what General Hodges have said, I totally agree too. It is necessary to give Ukraine everything that will help kill Russians, as many and as quickly as possible. That will lead changes in Russia. And now I would like to ask you a question that perhaps is a rhetorical question. We all agree, for the West, that sounds very cruel to drive them away, to keep killing them. But unfortunately, it is true, and Putin only understands this gangster system. It's not really a state per se. It's more of a criminal infrastructure, a mafioso state. They worried more about their pockets than about the laws of the state. But saying all that, there are many people in the West who believe that what needs to be done is to remember about Russians' importance in the world. They mentioned China, they mentioned economic reasons, and also some kind of romantic reasons. So what can we do to dissuade this mythology that Russia deserves such respect and such attention, that we need to take Russia into account? I am guided by the norms of international law. You know that international law does not allow to negotiate with terrorists. Russia is a terrorist state, and there are many countries, including the European Parliament, have made appropriate statements and passed decisions that Russia is a state of terrorism. So what the West needs to do is to bluntly call things what they are. If Russia is terrorist state number one in the world, we cannot continue talking with them like we did before. That's position number one, and that is first and foremost needs to be discussed at places like the Vilnius summit. Number two, what is needed for the West to do and realize, so that Western liberal communities understood the threats, not just for Ukraine, but much more deeply for themselves as well. Here, very brave decision need to be made by Western politicians to understand that there's no more time for collaboration with dictatorships. That time is over. It was an end was put to it by the Russian aggression, and so getting back to looking for compromise at a negotiation table, this cannot come back. And I would like to emphasize the action of dictatorships. Dictatorships, beginning with China, have already put together their military interests and their economic interests, and they are coming close to putting their financial interests together. And this is happening very quickly. It will come to an end soon. At that time, West will be confronted with a dilemma. Should we sit down and negotiate with dictatorships, not from the position of strength, but from the position of at least equal or even junior partner? That, I think, is the worst thing that can happen, and will have consequences not just for political leaders of the West, but for all residents of the Western countries who do not realize what Russian neo-imperialism really is. They ignore the fact that Russia's new policy, which was shaped by Putin with his criminal gang, it already has caused irreparable damage to Western democracies. It already has destroyed all democratic institutions and safety precautions such as UN, the Security Council, the IAEA, and they are trying to bring gangster methods into democratic procedures by giving bribes, corruption. Russia has launched information war Russia is totally destroying everything that had been created with so much effort after World War II. So as long, or rather until, the Western political leaders make definitions, including in Vilnius, which by all means must make a decision about admission of Ukraine to NATO after this war is ended. We will, if that doesn't happen, we will witness deployment of other military aggression in different ways, which will not be only against Ukraine, but on many other challenging places. It could be Taiwan, could be next, where the whole Indian Pacific region is affected. So my conclusion is this: the pink glasses, which were a part of the compromises policy after World War II, we need to replace those pink glasses with other glasses which give us a realistic view of what's happening in the world and the threats, not just for Ukraine, but for the rest of the world. If that doesn't happen, then my conclusion is very, very sad conclusion. Mankind can be drawn into a thermonuclear war. Well, this is not okay, but that's a reality. No, of course, that is not okay, but I'm thinking of how to end our conversation. I certainly agree with you. We've been trying to discuss these messages for a long time. We are not always listened to, but I think what you said today, we need to draw a conclusion for this and publish these messages to say how much Russia has already destroyed, and indeed it's time to get rid of those rosy glasses. We need to look at what really they have done, not just in Ukraine, but what they have done to the West as well. With this, let us draw a conclusion.
I just want to add my thanks to Yuri Kostenko and to General Hodges for an incredible, sobering, but really critical discussion about the dangers that the world is facing, and yet seems, as Yuri has said, wants to continue look through rose-colored glasses. Thank you so much. I think this was an incredibly timely discussion.
Yep.
And we will, as you say, Irena, we will make sure we will broadcast and distribute some of this commentary as broadly as we can. Again, thank you very much, Irena, for your moderating under some technical difficulties. So
okay,
thank you.
thank
Yuri.
you to everybody.